Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be listening from today. Welcome to another edition of American History from a Catholic perspective. I'm your host, Joseph Provost, military historian and historian of the early American Republic, and today we are going to go back in time, like we did last week, to the Revolutionary period of American history. In particular, today we are going to talk about spycraft. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Again, fasten your seatbelts, enjoy the ride, because today we are going back to the time of George Washington, a very young George Washington, mind you, at 21 years old. And we are going back to Virginia to find out the beginnings of what we now call the Central Intelligence Agency. So many of you have heard of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and are aware of its many spying activities throughout the world. Well, you probably aren't aware of their many spying activities throughout the world, mind you, because, well, if you knew about them, then it wouldn't be secret and it wouldn't be spying. So, with that in mind, let's go back to some time here in the early 1700s. So, George Washington was a surveyor in his time, in his youth. His father was a surveyor, and he followed in his father's footsteps. And when he was younger, Washington joined the Virginia militia, and he received a commission as a major in the Virginia militia. And this was during the time of the French settlements. Some of us are aware that during the early part of the 18th century, the latter part of the 17th century, there was a competitive spirit that imbued the Americas. We have the English settling along the coast in what we would later call the 13 colonies and the 13 original states. We have the French, who are also competing for land. And then we also have the Spanish. And we find that the French and the Spanish are predominantly Catholic, of course, and the English are not. Obviously, we know from our history, we talked a little bit last week about Anne Hutchinson and some of the challenges that she went through trying to embody the Protestant spirit of separation of whatever I believe is true versus the Catholic spirit, which is obedience to rule and order and law. And that is what the French and the Spanish brought. Now, keep in mind that this is a very interesting time because the French and the Spanish and the English are all competing for space, so to speak. They're competing for the ability to settle along not only just the coast of America, North America, but also the inland as well. So we find ourselves at this time, the French are setting up forts all along the Ohio River, okay? And what they're trying to do, the French at this point, is they're trying to stake a claim to the land that the British nonetheless would like to have. Now, keep in mind, too, at this point, the Spanish are predominantly in Florida, in the southwestern part of the country as well, towards, for example, missionaries among the Pueblo Indians, etc. So really, the two competing factions along this demarcation line, if you will, are the Spanish and, I take that back, the French and the English. And in order to stake their claim, what the French do is they put these plates all along the river on these trees, in the ground, etc., basically staking a claim to the area that they were on, saying this land is ours, and it's not the English. And the governor of Virginia, by the name of Mr. Dinwiddie, he wanted to really break this apart. The English were saying, no, this is our land, not the French's. The French were saying, no, it's ours, and they built huge forts to stake their claim, to ensure that their claim would last. Because again, keep in mind that anybody can make a claim. Anybody can say something that's true. But there comes a time and a place where you have to defend that claim. or else it's going to be taken from you. An example that I've given others in the past is been the Declaration of Independence. Now, this is going a little bit forward from our discussion here, but the Declaration of Independence was drawn up, right, and was published on July 4, 1776. Now, from the English standpoint, a Declaration of Independence means absolutely nothing. It's a piece of paper. It's a document that you wrote. A bunch of people sat down, they talked about it, they wrote it, we read it. What does that Declaration of Independence even mean? What does it even matter if you can't defend what you believe is written down on it? And until you can defend it and successfully defend it, then those principles don't really even matter at all. So keep that in mind as we talk about Washington and these claims of the French. So the French have these claims. They say that they have this land that they were basically taking the land from the Ohio River westward primarily to block the English from crossing those lands. I mean, that was rich territory. There was obviously plenty of land and livestock and other things of that nature. So obviously the English wanted that land, especially the Virginians. Keep in mind that the Virginians were the most populous of all the colonies. I mean, consider that both Virginia and Massachusetts Bay Colony were the two largest colonies at the time. Keep in mind also that the reason that this was because they had both the Virginia and the Plymouth companies, which were shipping companies, and they brought not only people over, but they traded goods back and forth between colonies and between the mother country. So they were the largest populated colonies because they had support. And Virginia, again, Governor Dinwiddie wanted somebody to go and tell the French, listen, this is our land, get off or else. And that's the short explanation of what happened. So at 21 years old, as a major in the Virginia militia, Dinwiddie selected Washington, not necessarily because he was an outstanding officer per se, but because he trusted him. He trusted he could carry out the mission. So Dinwiddie asked Washington to deliver a message to the French that basically the English claimed the land and that the French were to get off, or else there would be some forced combat. And so Washington left with a troop of individuals to help him get there for safety and for other reasons. He had somebody on the compass and others with the maps and others, medical individuals and what have you. And they left and they began to travel. Along his way, Washington met an Indian man. And this individual in particular, now the records aren't entirely clear of who he was exactly. I mean, there are some records that do say who he was, but without having further information on that, I don't want to give potentially false information. But the Indian, found out about Washington's mission to go to the fort, the Indian fort, and say to them that he was going to offer them essentially a surrender paper. And the Indian had found out about this and says, "Wait, I want to go with you." Because this Indian had his family broken apart and killed by the French. And they had given him a wampum belt. And a wampum belt basically is, for the Indians, was a form of payment, cash, money, something very important. If you received wampum, especially a wampum belt, it was a token of gratitude. And they had given this to him the French had given him this belt some years ago for his bravery in fighting alongside them. Now he was angry that they had destroyed his family, so he wanted to go with Washington to help not only to dismantle and destroy, but to give the wampum belt back to them and say enough is enough. Interestingly enough, they make their way out. Washington has to stop along his way. He goes to this fort, and he thinks it's the fort he's supposed to be at. He asks for the officer in charge, and they say, "Oh, this isn't the fort that you're looking for. That's down the way still, and we'll give you the directions to get there." And they say, "Well, why don't you stay the night? And why don't you stay the night and just have a meal with us and come to a party, and in the morning you can take off." So they did. Well, this is where Washington's spycraft really begins to cultivate itself. Because as they're eating and drinking, and Washington isn't really drinking as much as the French officers are, they begin to tell him all of this information about the plans of the French and their goals for the establishment of the French domain, if you will, in America. This is very, very interesting. And now Washington is listening to all this. He's listening to what they're saying about the movements of the troops and their plans for forts and their plans for attack. Keeping this all in mind, well, as sober as he was, he left that night, went to his own tent. He wrote all of this down in a journal, keeping all this information, this intelligence, as we would say. He put it into his journal, and he packed it away, tucked it away into his satchel, and off he went. Well, finally they arrive at the main fort, and it is very interesting to note this is really where the intelligence of not only our current day and age, the CIA, but the Revolutionary War, which made Washington what he was during the war, really played a factor. So he gets to the fort, and he says who he is, and he offers this paper to the French commander and says, listen, you need to evacuate, you need to leave because the governor has said so, this is our land. And the officer replies with a response that is interesting in a sense like, well, firstly, he says, well, no, we're not going to surrender, right? Obviously you have two competing factions here. But he then, in his arrogance, he invites Washington into the fort itself. Now, think about this from an intelligence standpoint. This is fascinating. This is absolutely incredible. Washington is coming to offer the French a paper stating that they need to evacuate, they need to leave, or else they will be forced to leave. And instead of being objecting to this, simply in kind, the French commanding officer says, no, actually, we're not going to surrender, but why don't you come inside? Let me show you around. And essentially what the French officer was trying to do was to boast and to brag about the fortifications and how Washington and the Virginians were not going to be able to overtake the French. It was this typical French arrogance. It was just something that you find then as you find now. My whole family is French, so I can speak a little bit about that. We are very, I want to say proud people, but we are very happy to be who we are. I guess that's the best way to say it, and we're proud of our heritage. So the French really weren't going to give up. And the next thing they did was extremely interesting and set the tone for not only Washington's trip back home to the governor in Virginia to give him some information, but also set the tone for what would become Washington's spy ring, which essentially was the deciding factor in the Revolutionary War. It was not, and I repeat, it was not sheer military brute force that won the Revolutionary War. We're going to get to that soon in the next few episodes. But it was Washington's ability to acquire information and to dispel misinformation that won the Americans the war against the British, the most powerful military force in the world at the time. So when we come back, I'm going to tell you what actually happened and how that ties into our Catholic understanding of not only colonial American history, not only the revolutionary history, but our history as members of the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church when we return. Welcome back to American History from a Catholic Perspective. So before the break, I was telling you about how George Washington met the commander of the French fort here on the Ohio River, and Washington was preparing to tell him, or in the process of telling this French commanding officer, that the order from Virginia, the order from Governor Dinwiddie, was that they were to evacuate. They were to leave their forts and to hand over the land to the English, to the Virginians. And instead of simply saying, no, that's it, we're not going to, and returning that message back to his governor, interestingly enough, the French commander says, why don't you come on inside the fort? Why don't you come and see what we have? He invited him not necessarily to do what Washington realized what was happening, but in fact he was out of pride, out of boasting, out of sheer arrogance. The French commander offered Washington and his men a look around. So Washington was able to go inside the fort. He was able to see the amount of men that were in the fort, defending the fort. He was also shown the amount of boats that they were carving, that they were getting ready to go down the river. And these were military boats. These weren't just simple transports. These were how many men can we fit in the boat at a time in order to effect a proper military assault. And Washington is seeing this. Now just imagine for a moment Washington in this moment at this stage of his trip, absolutely positively probably flabbergasted in his mind, because he simply was here on a simple mission to tell the French to leave, and now the French are actually inviting him, again, as an officer of the Virginia militia, he's a major at this time, inside of a fort. Now, to any military officer, this has got to be absolutely stupendous. I mean, can you absolutely imagine? Imagine somebody, a military officer, overseas in World War I, World War II, or the Gulf War, any war you can really imagine, being brought, or even in Vietnam, being brought into a hideout, if you will, a fort, a command center, being shown every single thing that they have, showing all their cards. I mean, can you imagine the generals and the colonels and others in Vietnam being shown exactly what the plans were for the destruction of the South Vietnamese? Or can you imagine the destruction and the information that you can obtain? Can you imagine the Americans walking into Hitler's compound and seeing all his plans and what the orders were of the day, and what divisions and what brigades were going where? This is absolutely mystifying about how a French commander would do this, but he did. It would be the same thing. It would be of the same nature as allowing our enemies, whoever they might be, walk inside the Pentagon into the safe room and say, hey, this is our plans for the next 5 years. That's absolutely ridiculous. Why would you do such a thing? I mean, you put it in that context, it really is mystifying. But nonetheless, it happened. So the mindset of Washington, again, I wish I could have been there. I wish I could have spoken to the man and just asked him these questions like, what was it like for you? What were you thinking about this? This is absolutely incredible. But nonetheless, so you're here with him. He's being walked around. He's seeing the canoes. He's seeing essentially their canoes were warships. I mean, obviously they didn't have guns on top of them, like, on a PT boat or anything like that. But they still serve the purpose of a military assault. And seeing the amount of men, the amount of boats, the fortifications the fort had, their weaponry, all of this was being shown to Washington. And then he left, and as he was leaving, he said his cordial goodbyes. But before they left, that Indian I mentioned earlier gave the wampum belt back, and that was the end of that for there. And they started to leave, and it was at this point that Washington was pursued. Him and his men were pursued because they realized what had gone on. They realized, I believe, their mistake. And they tried to go after Washington. He was able to break free. They set camp one night, but an Indian on the side of the French tried to attack Washington in his camp, and he shot at them. And what an interesting way to end one's life. The Indian that had given his wampum belt back was able to shield Washington from the bullets, took the bullet for Washington, and they made haste and got back to Virginia. Now, this brings up a couple of interesting points. The first point I want to make is directly related to Washington being shielded by the bullets. Now, there are some people that would argue that this shielding of Washington by bullets was another incident that showed the greatness of Washington, or almost his godly features. Many people have argued over the years that Washington was a man sent by God to establish this nation, not necessarily by his political aspirations, but by his military exploitations. Now, one can agree with that, one could disagree with that, but the fact remains that it's just interesting how Washington was surrounded by people who allowed him to carry out his mission. And even when he was later on run down and surrounded by the French and the Indians and had to build Fort Necessity and later had to surrender that, it's interesting to note that he was still spared at that moment. In all of these moments, Washington was somehow spared, which leads to what we would call the thesis of the indestructible Washington, the godlike Washington. And I wouldn't go that far. And in a future episode, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Washington and the miraculous crossing Christmas night in 1776 for the battles of Trenton and Princeton, and what that was like. But essentially, what I would say there in my thesis is that Washington wasn't as good as a person in this godly sense as people claim. He surrounded himself with very, very good people. He was a good delegator. He was a good leader in the sense that it wasn't all about him, although in the beginning that's what it was about him, but he learned how to work with people. But his initial actions brought the governor of Virginia, Governor Dinwiddie, lots of crucial information at such a crucial time. And this was the beginning of Washington's ability to be a spymaster. Every spy has a handler. And Washington was really the handler. He was the spymaster for what we would call the infancy of the Central Intelligence Agency, which wouldn't be created until the 20th century, but officially created until the 20th century. But actions of spycraft have been going on way before then. But this really gave Washington the idea that spying and using spycraft as a military strategy could be very, very useful. In fact, it's interesting to note that in the Revolutionary War, again, I don't have time today to go into the specifics of that, but that could be a whole series of spycraft in the Revolutionary War, multiple episodes to talk about that. It's absolutely fascinating. We've all heard of the great and infamous spy, Benedict Arnold, the traitor. But his story is really interesting as well because it shows how spycraft had evolved in such a short period of time, and how Washington, even in his youth, he was only 21 years old in this time that when he went to the French fort and was shown everything. But he remembered this. He remembered the success of this spying ability that he had, or that he applied, at least. Maybe he didn't realize even at the time what it was, but he realized that this was something that could be applied to future times and future places. And again, we know the story, or at least we might know the story, or we're listening to hope for me to tell you the story. But Washington's spy rings in the Revolutionary War were impeccable. Sometimes he gained much from them, and sometimes he lost some. But again, he was competing against the British in the Revolutionary War, and they had their own spy rings. I mean, people would be on both sides of the battlefield, Acting is one thing and being another. Saying that you were a revolutionary, you're a rebel against the British, but yet really you were on the British side and you were feeding information. So Washington's ability to be a spy, eventually won the Revolutionary War. And what I find interesting about this, again, it's a precursor to what we call the Central Intelligence Agency today, but it also ties into the question of Catholicism, ties into the question of the faith, it ties into the question of right and wrong, and it ties into the question of, is lying, is it okay? Is it okay in war? And the first part to that, I would say, is that war is not an environment in which anybody should pray for. War is evil. War is horrific. It's terrible. It is not something that we should wish on ourselves or anybody else, and it should not be something that the first thing we think about doing is having a combat with another nation or another people. No, we really shouldn't wish for these things. War is terrible. It's very, very bad. And quite frankly, war destroys many a good people, unfortunately. We all probably know somebody or have heard of somebody that has gone off to war in whatever era it might be and has not returned the same. It's a very difficult thing. So firstly, we shouldn't want any type of war. We should want to be peaceful people, because God is a God of order and of peace, but God also allows wars to happen. So to the question of should spying be allowed? That's a tough question, because we're running into the idea of, is it against the commandments to lie? Yes, we know it's a commandment to lie. So how far can we take this? And I would argue that we have to be very careful with interpretation on both sides. On the one side, we can't live in a world where we think that not spying or by not lying to others, like for example, that's what the misinformation platform or plank of spycraft is. It's giving the wrong information in order to get to the point, from point A to point B, without the enemy realizing that's what you're doing. They think you're going from A to C, but you're really going from A to B. So you're giving them misinformation in order to safeguard your people. So in one sense, you could say, well, that's wrong. It's breaking the commandment. But in the other sense, you're also sparing your men, potentially. You're sparing your side, if you will, from being obliterated. And I guess that is a difficulty of realizing whether this is Catholic or non-Catholic. I mean, we would say that the most obvious way is just strict combat, right? In the old days, in the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, we lined up and people, shot their muskets and their rifles at others, and that's how wars were essentially determined, or so we think. But regardless, whether we think it's right or wrong, it's something that has been done and something that has continued to be done. So we can't say that spycraft in and of itself is wrong, because again, if it's there to save lives and protect a nation, then maybe it's okay in that sense. But we also have to be careful to fall into this trap of telling things to others that are not true. For example, if you were in the CIA, or if you were a spy for a living, and then you got out of that kind of service, think about Washington. People say, "Well, he couldn't tell a lie." Yes, that's false. Washington could tell more than a lie. He was a spy. He was a spymaster. That's how he was able to win the war. So we can't really even go along with that sentiment. That's wrong. It's incorrect. So if anybody ever says that, "Oh, Washington could never tell a lie," they're wrong. He could tell a lie, and he said many of them. So he's not as great and godly as many people would like to credit him with, just like I mentioned earlier. But again, we have to be very careful, because once you begin that process of lying, of providing false information, of spying on other people, of getting into their business, that can actually transfer into regular life once you leave the spycraft or the military or what have you. And it'll be interesting to note in your own research, maybe in your own time, if you can do your some reading on this subject if it interests you, to find out if this did affect them long term. Again, I don't have the time today to go into that with you, but I think that might be a great topic for our listeners to really think, is this something that affected them long term? So I say two things. Spycraft was a reality of the Revolutionary War, of even before the French and Indian War, before it even started. It was a facet, it was a staple of the Revolutionary War, and it has been a constant factor in all wars, including our present day. So spycraft and lying have been part of our military history from the beginning. Whether it's right or wrong, again, I would say it's contextual. It depends on where we're at, what's really going on, how it's being used. But I would say be very careful when you consider these things, because, again, spycraft is really lying. And lying, again, for too long and in too many circumstances can lead into the destruction of the soul, because they get caught up in a false sense of reality, and that reality is not the reality of Almighty God. So again, that's just an interesting point today. It's going to lead into a future show into the Revolutionary War, and how the Revolutionary War was won was through spycraft and not mere brute force. But for today, I want to encourage you to really study this further, to consider our American history from our Catholic perspective. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about this and study this, I recommend the book Revolutionary Spies, Intelligence and Espionage in America's First War by Tim McNeice. It can be purchased online at Amazon.com, at Barnes & Noble, or other local booksellers near you. For Magnificat Radio at magnificatmedia.com, this is Joseph Provost here for American History from a Catholic Perspective. Until next time, God bless.